April 1943. The Kuban River Front. A cold wind scraped the morning sky as a formation of Luftwaffe Bf-109s sliced through the clouds, engines snarling. Below them, a handful of strange American-built fighters glinted in the pale light, short-nosed, stubby, and slow. The German leader laughed over the radio. "Airacobras," he said, half amused, half disgusted. "Easy kills." He nosed down, dove straight toward them, and lined up his sights. But the moment he fired, everything changed. The nearest P-39 banked hard, impossibly tight, its mid-mounted engine howling. It rolled inside his dive and unleashed a single burst, a thunderous crack from its 37mm cannon. One shell hit home. The German's wing exploded into flame. His laughter died in smoke. Below, the rest of the squadron broke formation. The Airacobras climbed like beasts, their pilots calm, measured, cutting through the air with the precision of men who knew exactly what their aircraft could do. By the time the sky cleared, 5 German fighters were gone, and the joke of the Allied Air Force had just rewritten its reputation. One kill at a time. To understand how the Bell P-39 Airacobra went from an object of ridicule to a symbol of dominance, we have to go back to the early, chaotic years of American fighter development, a time when engineers were trying to invent the future faster than the war itself was moving. In 1937, the Bell Aircraft Corporation proposed a radical idea: a fighter with its engine mounted behind the pilot. The design was supposed to fix the biggest flaw in piston engine fighters: drag at high speed. By placing the Allison V-1710 engine in the middle of the fuselage, Bell could shorten the nose, center the weight, and free up the entire front for one massive weapon: a 37mm cannon that fired straight through the propeller hub. It was a design far ahead of its time. The U.S. Army Air Corps called it the XP-39, a super interceptor. But there was a problem. To reach its potential, the Airacobra needed a turbocharger, a device that kept power steady at high altitude. In early prototypes, the aircraft screamed past 390 miles per hour. Yet, during bureaucratic reshuffling and production simplification, the turbocharger was removed. That single decision changed everything. Without it, the P-39 struggled above 15,000 feet. In the skies over Europe, where bombers flew high and interception required altitude, it was suddenly obsolete before it even arrived. When American pilots first flew it in combat over North Africa in 1942, they called it underpowered and overweight. They hated its cramped cockpit, its heavy nose, its temperamental landing gear. It was fast in a dive but slow to climb. In the thin air, German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs toyed with it. The verdict seemed final. The P-39 was a failure. Reports circulated through Allied command, unsuitable for European combat. Squadrons began replacing them with P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs. But across the Atlantic, one nation saw something different. When the Soviet Union joined the war in 1941, it was desperate for modern aircraft. Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States began shipping whatever could fly. Among them were hundreds of Airacobras, the rejected, misunderstood fighters no one else wanted. When the first crates arrived in Murmansk, Soviet mechanics unboxed them and stared at the strange machine with curiosity. The mid-engine layout was unfamiliar. The tricycle landing gear looked fragile. But the Red Air Force didn't laugh. They tested it, and within days, they realized what the Americans had missed. The P-39 was not built for altitude, but at low altitude in the brutal dogfights of the Eastern Front, it was perfect. The Russians fought their air battles at treetop level, strafing tanks, intercepting bombers, dueling German fighters barely above the fields. The Airacobra's heavy cannon, stability, and tight turning radius made it a monster in those conditions. Suddenly, the slow American plane became the fastest climbing predator under 10,000 feet. Its 37-millimeter cannon could tear through armor, wings, and even light vehicles on the ground. Its mid-engine balance gave it agility that no Messerschmitt could match in a turn, and its rugged construction meant it could take bullets and keep flying, a quality every Soviet pilot valued above all else. Within months, Russian aces began scoring kills in double digits. Among them was a name that would define the legend of the Airacobra, Aleksandr Pokryshkin, a man who would become the second highest-scoring Allied ace of the war. He flew the P-39 not as an underdog, but as a scalpel. He rewrote aerial tactics around it, using low-altitude hit-and-run maneuvers the Germans never saw coming. While American pilots dismissed the Airacobra, the Soviets turned it into a precision weapon, a plane designed for the kind of war they were fighting, not the one others imagined. By 1943, over 4,700 P-39s were flying with Soviet markings, and soon, the Germans who once mocked it would be forced to face it, at eye level, in the killing fields of the Kuban. By the spring of 1943, the P-39 Airacobra had found its home, not in American skies, but over the vast plains and ridges of the Eastern Front. What the U.S. had considered a design flaw, the Soviets called an advantage. The plane's low-altitude power matched the battlefield like a lock and key. German reconnaissance pilots had begun to report the presence of an unusual Allied aircraft, short-nosed, fast at tree level, and armed with a gun that could tear an engine block apart in one hit. They didn't know yet that it was American-made. They just called it Die kleine Kanone, the little cannon. When Luftwaffe pilots finally saw it up close, they laughed. The Airacobra looked squat and ungainly compared to the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109G or the Focke-Wulf 190. Its tricycle landing gear seemed fragile, its propeller stubby. The laughter didn't last long. The first large-scale encounter came over the Kuban bridgehead in April 1943. German fighter groups, supporting the Wehrmacht's defense of the Caucasus, expected an easy fight. Instead, their formations began disappearing. The P-39s didn't fight like anything the Germans had faced. They attacked from below, appearing suddenly out of the sun's glare at horizon level. They hit hard, vanished into the valleys, and climbed again at impossible angles. At the center of these engagements was Aleksandr Pokryshkin, flying his P-39 with the number 100 on the fuselage. To his squadron, it was a miracle machine. To the Germans, it was a mystery that killed. Pokryshkin developed a system of combat he called height-speed maneuver fire, emphasizing short vertical climbs, rapid rolls, and the precise burst of the 37-millimeter cannon at point-blank range. He treated air combat like geometry. Every turn, every dive was calculated, and the Airacobra's mid-engine balance gave him perfect control. He could flip the plane on its back, fire upward into a German belly, and roll away before a single tracer could touch him. The results were astonishing. Within months, Pokryshkin and his fellow pilots claimed more than 100 victories. By the end of the year, the Soviet Air Forces credited over 2,000 kills to Airacobra squadrons. Many of those came from pilots who, only a year earlier, had been flying biplanes. The Germans were forced to change tactics. They began warning new pilots, "Do not chase the Airacobra into a dive." Its low-altitude acceleration was deadly. Its cannon could destroy a fighter with one well-placed shot. Yet even with these warnings, they continued to underestimate it. Because it was American. Because it wasn't supposed to be dangerous. What they didn't realize was that Soviet mechanics had modified the aircraft. They stripped unnecessary equipment to make it lighter, tuned the Allison engines for cold weather, and optimized the propellers for low-altitude torque. In their hands, the P-39 was reborn. Meanwhile, in the West, American reports still called it obsolete. Pilots flying Mustangs and Thunderbolts looked down on the Airacobra as a footnote, Few knew that on the other side of the world, the same failed fighter was rewriting the rules of air combat. By the end of 1943, the numbers spoke for themselves. Over 2,400 confirmed kills, credited to Airacobra pilots on the Eastern Front. It had become one of the deadliest fighters in Soviet service, more effective in its environment than the vaunted Spitfire or Mustang. And in the process, it taught the world a lesson that no one at Bell Aircraft could have predicted: that innovation sometimes needs the right battlefield to prove its worth. For the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare with an American accent. For the Soviets, it was salvation in aluminum. And for the Americans, watching from afar, it was an uncomfortable reminder that a weapon's value isn't defined by who laughs at it first, only by who survives it last. At first glance, the Bell P-39 Airacobra didn't look revolutionary, but beneath its odd silhouette lay one of the most daring engineering experiments of the Second World War. Its engine placement was its defining trait. The 12-cylinder Allison V-1710 sat directly behind the pilot, driving the propeller through a long, precisely balanced shaft that ran under the cockpit floor. To most designers of the 1930s, the idea was madness. It complicated cooling, demanded a complex gearbox, and made maintenance awkward. But Bell's engineers weren't chasing simplicity. They were chasing performance balance. By moving the heavy engine to the center of the fuselage, they achieved an aircraft that rotated around its pilot like a figure skater on a perfect axis. Its roll rate was phenomenal, its stability in a high G-turn unmatched at low altitude. It wasn't graceful, it was surgical. Then there was its armament. The P-39 carried something no other fighter of its class possessed: a 37mm E2 M4 cannon firing through the propeller hub. Each shell was the size of a man's fist, capable of destroying an aircraft or lightly armored vehicle with a single hit. Supporting it were two synchronized 50-caliber machine guns and four 30-caliber wing guns, giving it devastating punch in the short, brutal dogfights of the Eastern Front. This combination made the P-39 less a high-altitude interceptor and more a gun platform, a weapon designed to dominate the space where men could see each other's eyes. Its tricycle landing gear, another first, gave it unprecedented ground stability and takeoff control on short, muddy runways, conditions common in the Pacific Islands and the frozen Soviet steppe. Pilots could taxi without wobble and fire immediately upon takeoff, an advantage invisible to those judging it from pristine European airfields. Its weakness, altitude performance, became irrelevant in Russia. Most air battles occurred below 10,000 feet, where the P-39's Allison engine delivered its full torque. German pilots, accustomed to energy fighting in thinner air, suddenly found themselves dragged into knife fights that their aircraft couldn't win. The same design that had failed America's high-altitude doctrine became perfect for the front-line war. Fast, vicious, low. The Airacobra's success in Soviet hands wasn't only mechanical, it was philosophical. Western pilots were trained to think vertically, climb high, dive fast, strike once, and break away. Soviet doctrine was horizontal, combat as a dance across the treetops. The P-39 fit that dance perfectly. Pokryshkin and his comrades discovered that at 300 miles per hour, the Airacobra could turn tighter than any German fighter in service. They built their tactics around this fact, forming what they called the Cobra Circle. 2 or 3 P-39s would orbit each other in a tight horizontal wheel, covering each other's tails. Any German attempting a pass would fly straight into the firing arc of another Airacobra. It turned the Luftwaffe's single-plane aggressiveness against itself. At the same time, The P-39's acceleration from level flight to vertical climb was brutal. Pilots learned to lure opponents into following them upward, then stall their own aircraft deliberately, flip inverted, and fire as the pursuer overshot. The cannon's recoil kicked like a hammer, but one shell was usually enough. For ground attack, the Soviets adapted it further. They replaced the outer wing guns with rockets or extra ammunition. Flying at treetop height, they used the 37-10 to rip through trains, trucks, even tanks. Pokryshkin himself scored kills against German armored columns, hitting engine decks from the side before pulling up through flak that couldn't track his speed. Every pilot developed a personal rhythm with the aircraft. The Airacobra wasn't forgiving. It demanded attention, sensitivity, and constant control of its weight balance. But once mastered, it responded like a living thing. American instructors who visited Soviet bases later were stunned. They saw maneuvers impossible to replicate in U.S. training manuals. The CET, result of pilots who understood the aircraft's temperament better than its builders ever had. The joke of right field had become the nightmare of the Kuban. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe's loss reports began to show a new pattern. The cause of destruction often listed only one phrase: hit by 37mm cannon fire. The Airacobra was no longer a curiosity. It was a statistic. For the Luftwaffe, the arrival of the P-39 was more than a tactical surprise. It was an insult to their pride. German pilots had built their identity on mastery of the sky. They flew high, struck fast, and trusted their technology to outclass anything the Allies produced. When they first encountered the Airacobra, they dismissed it as another piece of American over-engineering. But the first duels over the Kuban Front changed that perception. The P-39s did not behave like ordinary opponents. They didn't climb to meet the Germans. They waited for them. They stayed low, used the sunlight and terrain, and forced the fight into a space the Messerschmitts couldn't dominate. German reports began describing enemy fighters with uncanny maneuverability. One pilot wrote in his log, "They turn beneath you, and suddenly they are behind you. They fire once, and your plane is gone." The Luftwaffe had been trained to exploit weakness, yet the Airacobra had turned its flaws into traps. Its short range, its limited ceiling, irrelevant here. What mattered was that below the clouds, its 37mm cannon could end a fight in seconds. The laughter that once greeted its stubby shape gave way to silence, then to respect. The Germans never quite understood why their own high-altitude machines faltered against it. But the Soviets understood perfectly. The P-39 was never meant to rule the stratosphere. It was built to kill in the air men actually fought in. Every aircraft becomes a mirror of its pilot. The P-39 reflected its owner's personalities: blunt, methodical, fearless. For Soviet airmen, the Airacobra was not just a machine. It was an equal partner in survival. They decorated its nose with names and slogans: Za Rodinu, Za Stalina, Molnia. They treated it like a living ally, one that could be trusted when their own nerves faltered. Its cockpit was tight, its controls heavy, and its gun recoil violent enough to jolt the whole airframe. Yet the men who flew it described a strange calm once they learned its rhythm. Pokryshkin said, "It demanded respect. Once you gave it, it obeyed." For American pilots who had written it off, the transformation was humbling. Visiting officers in 1944 were stunned to find that Soviet flyers had achieved kill ratios far beyond what U.S. squadrons had managed with supposedly superior aircraft. Many returned home wondering how a discarded design had become a legend, and what that said about the limits of doctrine. In both nations, the Airacobra left its mark on people more than numbers. It taught pilots to adapt, to question, and to listen to their machines. It proved that no weapon is useless, only misunderstood. War has a way of deciding what truly matters. The story of the Airacobra is not just about mechanics or tactics. It's about perception, how arrogance blinds, and how humility reveals. The Germans mocked what they didn't understand. The Americans underestimated what they didn't need. The Soviets looked at the same machine and saw potential. That difference, in mindset, not material, defined the outcome. The P-39's journey became a metaphor for the war itself. Innovation ignored, then redeemed under pressure. It showed that greatness sometimes hides behind imperfection, and that in combat, the best weapon is simply the one used with intelligence and conviction. When the last P-39s rolled to a stop in 1945, their paint chipped and their cannons silent. They left behind a quiet legacy. Proof that technology alone doesn't win wars. Understanding it does. And somewhere in that truth, beneath the roar of engines and the smoke of combat, lies the reason this awkward little fighter became one of the most respected machines of World War II. April 1943. The Kuban River Front. The dawn mist rolled like smoke over the ridges. To the west, the Black Sea shimmered behind the haze of artillery fire. The air smelled of salt, cordite, and spring thaw. Above it all, squadrons of German fighters prowled in wide circles, confident as ever. They'd fought the Soviets here for months, cutting through Yakovlevs and Lags like hawks through sparrows. The Luftwaffe's elite believed the front was secure. But this morning would prove otherwise. Down below, on an airstrip carved from frozen mud, a line of P-39 Airacobras sat gleaming under the faint light. Their olive-drab paint was scuffed and patched. Their fuselages bore the red star. Pilots climbed aboard, helmets pulled tight, faces expressionless. Leading them was Major Aleksandr Pokryshkin, flying Airacobra 100. His orders were simple. Intercept a German formation moving toward the Kuban bridgehead. The reality was far more complex. He was outnumbered 2-1, facing veteran pilots flying Messerschmitt 109Gs with superior altitude advantage. Pokryshkin didn't care. He'd studied the Germans long enough to know their rhythm. High dive, attack, climb away, reset. He planned to break that rhythm. At 0700 hours, his squadron of 12 Airacobras roared off the strip. The engines thundered against the valley walls, climbing just high enough to skim the cloud ceiling. At 9,000 feet, they leveled off, below the expected engagement altitude. It was counterintuitive, but Pokryshkin wanted them low. Minutes later, dark specks appeared overhead. 30 German fighters escorting Stukas toward Soviet ground positions. Pokryshkin keyed his radio. Do not climb. Wait until they descend. The Germans, spotting movement below, immediately dove to engage. It was their standard tactic. A vertical slash, fast and devastating. But this time, the prey didn't scatter. Instead, the Airacobras rolled inward and pulled a coordinated brake turn. 12 aircraft pivoted like clockwork, crossing each other's flight paths in a deadly weave. The Germans followed. and fell straight into the trap. At 3,000 feet, the Soviets opened fire. Pokryshkin's cannon roared once, a burst of thunder that split the morning sky. The shell tore through a Messerschmitt's engine block, the aircraft disintegrating in midair. His wingman caught another in the same instant. The Germans pulled up, shocked, but the Airacobras pursued vertically, impossible maneuvers for their altitude. One German pilot later described it in disbelief. They came from below like wolves, one after another. You fired once, and they were already behind you. For 20 minutes, the air above Kuban turned into a maelstrom. The Germans couldn't escape upward. Their engines lost power in the humid air. The Airacobras, built for this altitude, maneuvered with terrifying precision. Pokryshkin's voice cut through the static. Don't chase. Hit and vanish. Let them burn on the way down. By Euro 725, the sky was littered with falling wrecks, black trails marking where confidence had turned into smoke. The Soviets reformed, counted, dove again. 5 more German planes fell in the second attack wave. The Luftwaffe commander ordered retreat, stunned that his unit, one of the most experienced on the Eastern Front, had lost control to inferior aircraft. When the last German broke off, Pokryshkin's squadron still had fuel, ammo, and formation. In less than half an hour, 12 Airacobras had destroyed 14 enemy fighters without a single loss. The legend began that morning. News of the Kuban engagement spread across the front like wildfire. Soviet ground troops cheered as they watched wreckage burn in the distance. Mechanics hugged each other on the runway when the squadron returned. And from that day on, the Airacobra ceased to be a curiosity. It was a weapon of fear. The Germans, humiliated, rewrote their airfield briefings. Engage P-39s only with altitude advantage. Avoid low-altitude pursuit. But the damage was done. The invincible image of the Luftwaffe was cracking. Not under bombers or flak, but under the roar of an American fighter they had once mocked. The victory over Kuban rippled far beyond the smoke that still hung over the river valley. It wasn't just a tactical win, it was a shift in perception. The moment the flying joke became a symbol of mastery. Within days, reports from German field intelligence reached Berlin. They described the engagement as unprecedented. The high enemy, the Soviets, had used American-built fighters with devastating precision at low altitude. Commanders were ordered to study the new tactics immediately. But the warning came too late. Through the summer of 1943, the Airacobras multiplied. Pokryshkin's 16th Guards Fighter Regiment began flying 3 sorties a day. They attacked German transport convoys, shredded bomber escorts, and executed vertical ambushes that stunned even veteran Luftwaffe aces. At the same time, across the globe, another group of pilots was rediscovering the aircraft that America had discarded. In the humid jungles of New Guinea and Guadalcanal, U.S. Army Air Force's units still operated small groups of P-39s, leftovers of early deployments. Against the Japanese, who fought at similar low altitudes, the Airacobra's strengths reappeared. Lieutenant Gerald Johnson of the 8th Fighter Group called it a beast that doesn't forgive mistakes, yours or theirs. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could pivot tighter than a zero and take far more punishment. By mid-1943, American squadrons began modifying their tactics to mirror the Soviets, diving, turning, and climbing in short bursts rather than chasing altitude. The results were immediate. In one engagement over New Guinea, 5 Airacobras shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in under 5 minutes. Suddenly, the U.S. command started looking again at the numbers and at the reports coming from Moscow. The data was irrefutable. By the end of 1943, P-39 pilots, mostly Soviet but also American and Free French, had accumulated over 2,400 confirmed kills. It was no longer a failure. It was one of the deadliest fighters of the war. Even those who once mocked it began to rethink what they had thrown away. Bell aircraft, watching from Buffalo, received word from Soviet engineers asking for more units. Not redesigned, not improved, just more. The factory kept the line running through 1944, shipping nearly 5,000 Airacobras to the USSR alone. The Luftwaffe learned to fear the shape of that short-nosed silhouette on the horizon. When reconnaissance spotted formations of Airacobras near the Dnieper or Crimea, bomber runs were often delayed or redirected. They knew what came next. Fast, low, unseen. Pokryshkin himself became a legend. Flying the same Airacobra for over 2 years, he racked up more than 59 confirmed kills, most of them against the very pilots who once dismissed his aircraft as obsolete. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, a distinction granted to only one other man in history. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the story began to circulate quietly. War correspondents wrote brief mentions of an American fighter making unexpected impact in Soviet hands. Engineers at Bell called it poetic. Justice, the underdog that proved everyone wrong. What shocked American brass even more was how effectively the Soviets had adapted it. They'd refined its systems, replaced gauges with Cyrillic markings, even adjusted gun sights for closer engagements. The P-39 had stopped being American. It was now Russian in spirit, but still undeniably American in soul. And that soul was endurance through imperfection. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots who had once called it a flying coffin spoke about it with respect. In interviews decades later, veterans admitted they dreaded the sight of its stubby wings and centerline cannon flash. One German ace, Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter pilot in history, reportedly warned his cadets, "If you meet the Airacobra below the clouds, climb away. Do not fight it there. You will not come back." That single statement said what no propaganda could. The laughter had stopped. In just 2 years, a discarded prototype had gone from a factory floor punchline to the most feared low-altitude fighter on 2 continents. And behind that transformation wasn't a miracle or luck. It was adaptability, the purest American quality. The Airacobra had found its war, its pilots, and its purpose. By 1944, as Mustangs and Thunderbolts took over the headlines, the P-39 quietly kept killing, escorting bombers, striking ground targets, and holding the skies below the clouds, where the real war still raged. It would never be glamorous. But in the smoke and blood of the Kuban, in the jungles of the Pacific, and in the memories of every pilot who had faced it, the Airacobra earned something far more lasting than fame. It earned fear. When the war's smoke finally began to clear in 1945, and the noise of engines faded over Europe and the Pacific, the record books quietly told a story that few had expected. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, the aircraft everyone had doubted, had become one of the most successful Allied fighters of the entire war. Across all fronts, pilots flying the P-39 had achieved more than 2,400 confirmed aerial victories, a figure that placed it among the top 5 most lethal Allied fighters. Yet the irony remained. The vast majority of those victories were not American. They belonged to Soviet pilots who had taken a discarded American machine and turned it into a precision instrument of destruction. At Bell Aircraft's plant in Buffalo, engineers read the combat summaries with disbelief. The same airplane that U.S. squadrons had begged to replace had become a legend on the other side of the world. Its flaws had been repurposed into advantages. The very absence of a turbo supercharger, once seen as a crippling limitation, meant the aircraft was lighter, faster to accelerate at low altitude, and less prone to engine failure under strain. Military analysts studying post-war data began to realize that the P-39 story was not just about performance. It was about context. Weapons succeed or fail depending on where and how they are used. In high-altitude Europe, it had been a misfit. In the low-altitude, close-quarters brawls of the Eastern Front, it was perfection. This realization quietly reshaped post-war fighter design philosophy. When engineers began drafting early jet aircraft, the F-80 Shooting Star in the United States, the MiG-9 in the Soviet Union, they incorporated lessons from the Airacobra's centralized mass and pilot-centered balance. The concept of a stable gun platform with a heavy forward cannon became a design standard. In training circles, too, the Airacobra's legend grew. U.S. instructors began using its combat history to teach a new doctrine: adaptability. Pilots were reminded that the perfect airplane doesn't exist, only the right pilot for the right mission. Even its critics began to soften. Reports from the U.S. Army Air Forces concluded, when applied in conditions suited to its strengths, the P-39 exhibits outstanding performance and combat reliability. Soviet leaders went further. Marshal Konstantin Vershinin of the Red Air Force declared publicly, "Without the Airacobra, many of our victories in the South would have cost twice as much blood." For the first time, an American machine had become an icon of Soviet air power, a symbol of alliance born from necessity, not politics. When production ended in 1944, Bell had delivered more than 9,500 units, 2/3 of them to the Soviet Union. Many returned home battered, patched with field repairs and bullet holes, but still flying. Some were kept in service into the early 1950s, guarding airfields and borders in the dawn of the jet age. To the men who built it, it was validation. To those who flew it, it was memory. To the Luftwaffe, it was a warning that arrogance can be fatal. When the war finally ended, the Airacobra's journey seemed to fade into the background noise of victory. The world moved on to jets, radar, and rockets. Yet in quiet hangars and airfields from Alaska to the Caucasus, its legacy lingered, in the hands of those who had learned to master it. The United States retired the P-39 with little ceremony. Newer aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt took the headlines. Their speed and altitude range symbolized the future of air combat. But the lessons the Airacobra had taught its engineers were already flowing into the next generation. Bell's designers took everything they had learned: the mid-engine layout, the emphasis on balance, the forward-firing cannon, and built its successor, the P-63 King Cobra. It was sleeker, faster, and more refined, but its soul was the same. More than 2,000 King Cobras were produced, and in a quiet nod to history, most of them went to the Soviet Union as well. For the Soviets, The Airacobra never truly died. Pilots who had cut their teeth on it trained new generations in its tactics. The low-level roll, the snap-turn ambush, the single-shot cannon strike. In their museums and memoirs, they spoke of it not as an American machine, but as their fighter. The plane that had carried them from desperation to dominance. Even decades later, veterans would gather and speak of its distinct sound, the deep hum of the engine behind their shoulders, the heavy click of the cannon charging, the tremor that ran through the fuselage when it fired. "When you heard that sound," one Russian pilot said, "you knew the fight was yours." Historians now see the P-39 story as more than a technical footnote. It represents a truth that echoes across every generation of warfare. That innovation alone means nothing without adaptation. The Airacobra failed in the environment it was designed for, yet triumphed in the one no one predicted. It became a case study in humility, for engineers, for pilots, and for nations. The Germans learned that arrogance could blind even the most disciplined Air Force. The Americans learned that their own cast-offs could change the course of another front. And the Soviets learned that understanding a weapon's nature can make it lethal beyond its design. By the early 1950s, most Airacobras had been scrapped. A few survived in museums, their olive paint faded, their once lethal cannon now harmless steel tubes. But every so often, one is restored to flight. And when its propeller spins to life, that same metallic snarl fills the air again, as if the past itself is exhaling. Those who know its story don't hear an old fighter sputtering. They hear a reminder that sometimes the machines we laugh at are the ones that end up rewriting the rules. History rarely remembers the quiet machines, the ones that didn't win headlines, or appear in propaganda films, or stand on pedestals after victory. But sometimes, those are the ones that matter most. The Bell P-39 Airacobra began as a disappointment, a machine mocked by its enemies, dismissed by its creators, and nearly forgotten by its own country. It was too heavy, too strange, too flawed. Yet in the right hands, in the right war, it became a weapon of precision and defiance. It taught soldiers and engineers alike that greatness isn't born from perfection. It's born from understanding, from seeing potential where others see failure. When the Luftwaffe laughed, it didn't see what the Soviets would discover, that the Airacobra's flaws were only flaws if you fought the wrong war. At treetop level, where the earth and sky blur, it was unstoppable. And in that transformation, from ridicule to respect, lies a truth that outlives wars. Innovation doesn't end when the blueprint fails. It begins when someone refuses to stop believing in it. The Airacobra never ruled the skies, but it ruled the space where men proved that adaptability can turn weakness into strength, and laughter into silence. Today, when one of the few surviving P-39s starts its engine, the sound is deep and uneven, like an echo from a forgotten chapter. To most, it's just another relic of the past. But to those who know its story, it's something else. The heartbeat of a machine that refused to die, and the reminder that even the most underestimated designs can change the course of a war. A failure that became a legend, a joke that became a weapon, a laugh that turned into thunder. The Airacobra's sky may be silent now, but its lesson still flies.